Hello and welcome back. Today I'd like to talk to you about a few things. The first of these is myth and how it relates to historical fact. What is a myth? A myth is a story that gives an explanation for something for which we have no scientific explanation. It comes from the Greek word mythos, which means story or tale. And this week, as part of your extra reading, you'll be doing some of Homer's Odyssey. Well, who is Homer? Homer is a poet who lived a long, long time ago. He lived in the 8th century BCE, so 700s BCE, and the current consensus among scholars is that there was a single poet who gave us the poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey. The poems of Homer weren't actually written down and put in one place until the tyrant Pisistratus put them together in the second half of the 6th century in Athens. Alexandrian scholars gave the poem its very final form in the 2nd and 3rd centuries BCE. In other words, gave them the forms that we now have today. The question I get asked a lot as a teacher is any of this actually real? And I would say this: if myth serves a societal function, if myth tells a story that's worth telling because it perpetuates certain values and tells us certain things about who we are, then in a sense Homer is real. But what if some people thought that the stories depicted in Homer actually happened? It turns out there's a guy who thought that the stories depicted in Homer's Iliad and Odyssey actually did happen, and his name was Heinrich Schliemann. We'll talk about him more in a minute. But today's lecture really then is about the intersection of myth, archaeology, oral culture, and linguistics, and what they have to tell us about each other. Hang on, it's quite a ride. So the first part of our lecture has to do with material culture. What's material culture? Material culture is the things people leave behind. It's the stuff that people will find that we've left behind hundreds of years from now. Our trash, our books, our computers, our buildings. And when we talk about material culture and the exploration of Homeric myth, we have to start with this guy, Heinrich Schliemann. He's a German businessman who became very rich in the 1840s and the 1850s, selling indigo and other commodities. Heinrich Schliemann didn't grow up rich, though. Heinrich Schliemann was the son of a minister who didn't manage his money wisely. Heinrich Schliemann then didn't get the chance to have a first-rate education that he could have had. You see, back then, it was considered the classy thing to do to know Latin and Greek. Heinrich Schliemann missed out on that opportunity because of his father's poverty. However, when he became rich, he was determined to do everything he could to impress those around him. He became so rich in his business that he actually ended up marrying a Russian heiress. In order to impress her, because she wasn't all that impressed with him except for his money, Heinrich decided that the classy thing to do was to learn ancient Greek so that he could read Homer's Iliad and Odyssey in the original. The thing was, he believed that the stories presented in Homer were actually true. And in the 1870s, he shocked the archaeological and scholarly communities by informing them that he intended to prove these places presented in these stories were real. He intended to find Troy. Well, it turns out he had a fair idea where he thought Troy was. It was right over here in his mind at the edge of what is now Turkey in a town called Hissarlik. He got there and he started digging, and lo and behold, he found enormous walls, like the ones in this picture right here. In fact, he came to be able to date all the different layers of what he called Troy. Hissarlik, or Troya, as it's known today, is on the top layer, and the older levels of this settlement are, guess what? Further down in the ground. And we now call this process stratigraphy. We date layers of a settlement to within a certain date range, given how far they are down. We do this using something called cultural assemblage, which is a collection of items from a single datable component of an archaeological site. Here I am digging in Italy, and you can see that I'm pulling up a piece of pottery. It's actually beneath another layer of other pottery, so it probably was buried at an earlier point in time. It turns out that he didn't just find walls or pottery at Hissarlik. He actually found a lot of really cool jewelry, like this brooch pin to the left and this necklace to the right. He went so far as to call them the jewels of Helen, after Helen of Troy. Well, things didn't work out between Heinrich Schliemann and his Russian heiress wife, but he met someone new, someone named Sophie, and he found so much cool stuff at his dig at Hissarlik, and he wanted to prove so badly to people around him the things he discovered were real, that he would dress Sophie up in the so-called Jewels of Helen and parade her around at parties to show the world what he discovered. He wasn't done yet. He then traveled from Hissarlik, which is over here, all the way over to central Greece, to Mycenae, on the edge of the Peloponnesus. And there he dug up more stuff. He found the Bronze Age fortress at Mycenae, which the locals had known had been around for ages, but didn't really understand how old it was. He dug and dug and dug and discovered these walls here, and this thing here called the Lion Gate. He dug up the so-called Treasury of Atreus. Inside the Treasury of Atreus, you'll find the largest dome in the ancient world before Hadrian built his Pantheon. He found enormous tombs that archaeologists came to refer to as beehive tombs, because they're composed of many different little chambers that spiral outwards. Here's another shot of a beehive tomb at Mycenae. Even more impressively, perhaps, he found gold, and what he called the Mask of Agamemnon, after the famous Greek warlord. The pottery that was there depicted a warlike culture, a culture that bears a shocking resemblance to what we see depicted in the writing of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. The shields they're carrying have half-moon or crescent moon shape, and their helmets are covered with ivory or bone. And here we have actual finds from the Mycenae fortress and more pottery. Here's a sword from Mycenae which actually matches the description of the kinds of swords we find in Homer. And yet more jewelry. Stay tuned for more about what material culture has to do with Homer, myth, and the actual Bronze Age world. See you then.